The views and opinions expressed during Eye on the Triangle do not represent WKNC or NC State student media. Your dial is currently tuned to Eye on the Triangle on WKNC 88.1 FM HD1. Thanks for listening. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're enjoying your day. My name is Emilia Rivadeneira, host of Eye on the Triangle, and with further ado, let's get into some news. The following interview was recorded before the ballot delivery was set on pause. According to the Carolina Public Press, NC absentee ballots were supposed to begin going out on September 6, 2024, but Kurt has delayed them while presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s name is removed. Hello and welcome to WKNC's Eye on the Triangle, your source of local news where we dive deep into the pressing issues affecting our communities. I'm your host, Emilia Rivadeneira, and here with us today is Chris Cooper, Robert Lee Madison Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Public Affairs and Director of the Hare Institute for Public Policy Institute at Western Carolina University. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So in our previous program of, the first kind of episode of Politics Unpacked, which is this Eye on the Triangle's new coverage of election season, we kind of look back at the summer's events to kind of get up to speed of what's going on. But today I really wanted to dig into specific issues that could influence the election results here in North Carolina specifically, kind of break down some key topics and see how they might impact our state's political landscape now that we're super close to elections as well. So I actually kind of wanted to talk first about an article that you published for the London School of Economics daily blog, and it was about aligning the potential outlook for the upcoming elections in North Carolina, and it was noting that the state was denominated as purple, but back then in May when this was published, things were super different. It was Joe Biden who was in the race, and now it's Kamala Harris. So I wanted to ask you, how have these changes impacted the electoral landscape in North Carolina, and does the state continue to be viewed as a purple state?
Yeah, no, it's great question. Yeah, it's been a sea change, right? And we've seen so many different things. There's been an assassination attempt. We had a changeover at the top of the Democratic ticket, which had a trickle-down effect, of course, of having a new vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket. So a whole lot happened. So what's been the effect of that? I think the effect of that pretty clearly from the polling has been to tighten this race, right? So my conclusion back in May was that we are a purple state. I've got a book coming out in a couple of weeks called Anatomy of a Purple State, sort of making that argument. But boy, it really seems to be even a darker shade of purple today, right? So almost every poll that's come out recently, so East Carolina, High Point, the New York Times, Siena poll, Cook Political Report, they've all got us right smack in the middle of that margin of error.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if we think about what's happened with since Harris, so we got tightening polls. We have an increasing number of new registrants, new voter registrations that are coming from the Democrats. We're used to seeing more Republicans. We're seeing more Democrats. And we're also seeing some massive fundraising numbers come out of the Harris campaign. So we'll see if they can translate that into votes, right? Your vote doesn't count twice if you're super pumped to cast it. But but it does seem like they're doing a good job thus far translating excitement into something that's more meaningful.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And you mentioned, Democratic voter registration has kind of increased. And so I also wanted to ask, has there been any Harris effect I've seen everywhere in the media, after Harris? Does Harris candidacy influence in just Democrats wanting to register to vote?
Yeah, absolutely. So Fortunately for us in North Carolina, the voter registration data are really easy to track. Anybody can. And what we see is that in most of the previous weeks before the big switch from Biden to Harris, the Republicans would beat the Democrats in new voter registrations. This is not total registrations now. This is new voter registrations. Unaffiliated, of course, beats both of them, but that's a different conversation. So, right after the big switch, that trend flipped where it became the Democrats, not the Republicans, who are registering slightly more voters every week. And so, I think what that means is that, yes, we've been able to translate, the Democratic Party's been able to translate that excitement into something more measurable, into these new voters. We'll see whether they actually show up and cast that vote and get off the couch
Right.
or just register. And we'll also see what happens with that large number of unaffiliated voters, which beats the Democrats and the Republicans.
Right, for sure. And kind of going back to that denomination of purple state, a lot of reports online have mentioned that this race specifically has been one of like classified of like the hardest ones to just like know, like in specifically North Carolina, who's like on top, like who's winning, and so like, is it would it still be considered North Carolina purple state or not?
Yeah, I mean, to me, to be a purple state, you don't necessarily need to be a swing state, right? So purple means you're kind of close to the middle, right? You're between red and blue. And so if we look at the last election, 2020 is just a line in the sand. Yes, we were of course colored red on the map. All of our electoral college votes went to the Republican candidate for President Donald Trump. But of all the states that Donald Trump won, his margin was the smallest in North Carolina of any of them, right? So we
Mhm.
were just on the right side, the Republican side of that razor's edge. And I think that's really why I think we're best described, not so much as a swing state, because we haven't gone for a Democrat since 2008, but that we
Right.
are very much a purple state.
Right. And what factors, like besides Harris'
Mhm.
candidacy now, have like influenced in this like competitiveness, here in North Carolina?
Yeah, so I mean, we can look down the ballot, right? So currently, our congressional delegation is 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans. It doesn't get any more purple than that. Now, we're going to see a very different delegation come this fall, thanks to some more redistricting. Some might call gerrymandering, some would just call redistricting. I think we can just say for today that the lines have changed, and because the lines have changed, the delegation is going to change.
Hmm.
But we've also seen, of course, we have a Democratic governor today, Roy Cooper, no relation. And then got also a Democratic Secretary of State, a Democratic State Auditor, and a Democratic Attorney General. Those may not be at the tip of your tongue, but these are statewide offices where people have elected Democrats. And so, again,
Hmm.
I think these are all kind of put it together. It certainly doesn't lead to the conclusion that we're a blue state. No one would argue that with a straight face, but that we are better described as purple than we are as red.
Right. Yeah. Um, and talking about specific issues, what statewide issues would you say are currently kind of dominating the conversation around the elections here in North Carolina?
Sure. Yeah. Like there's an old line that a guy named James Carville, who is a Democratic strategist, at that point was a Democratic strategist, more active with the Clinton campaign. He said that it's the economy, stupid. In other words, it's always about the economy. I think he said that in 1992. And in
Hmm.
2024, that's still correct. I mean, that is the number one issue. And that is an issue that I see as being about framing, right? There are things you can point to say, the economy is going well. There are things you can point to and say the economy is going poorly. And
Right.
each party is going to try to use that to their advantage, right? So that's kind of a framing effect, if you will. Then there is the what I call the agenda setting issues. So the Democratic Party wants this very much to be an election about abortion rights, and the
Hmm.
Republican Party wants this very much to be an election about the border. And so the fight there is less about framing and more about which issues are the ones that voters use to make a decision. Again, with each party kind of making the opposite argument.
Right. And in relating to those issues, abortion specifically and like the border as well, you mentioned, um, how is each candidate like doing well in North Carolina with just like those issues specifically? Because a lot of people are conservative and like, abortion rights is huge now. Nowadays it's a topic of debate. So are they doing well with just like, handling those issues here in North Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, these issues, abortion and the border, those are ones where people tend to favor opposite parties. So people do tend to be closer on average to the Democratic position on abortion rights. Yes,
Mhm.
there, of course, there are many conservatives in the state who think abortion should be completely illegal, but they are in the minority compared to the people that are closer to the Democratic position. On the border, I think we're seeing, again, the opposite. I think more people polls would show are closer to the Republican position on the border, fairly or unfairly, than the Democratic position. So that's why I think those are really more about agenda setting than they are about persuasion. It's about which one are people using top of mind to make their decision at the ballot box. Again, with the economy kind of being number one.
Right. Yeah. Um, and would you say this issues or like the candidate like policies surrounding these issues and specifically the economy, since it's like, top of our minds now, would affect their chances of winning?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I think sort of not just the reality of the economy, but perceptions of the economy. And I think we need to be clear on that, right? Sometimes I see people getting into fights about, which metric to use or whether the economy is really going well or not. And of course, that's important. But in terms of the electoral dynamics, the key is how do we perceive these things happening? And so somebody can say all they want. That inflation is going down over the last few months, but if you still go to the grocery store and it feels like a lot for milk, then it doesn't really matter
Yeah.
what statistic somebody lays at you.
No, yeah, for sure. And besides just talking about statewide issues, I wanted to ask you what other factors might impact voter turnout here in North Carolina, um, just in general.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is what the parties do themselves, right? So it's about party mobilization. The Democratic Party has not done as good of a job as the Republican Party in the last few years of just getting their voters out to vote. So the last
Yeah.
year, the Democratic turnout matched Republican turnout was 2008. Not coincidentally, 2008 is the last time that North Carolina went for a Democrat for president. So I think it's
Right.
partly about party effort, about party mobilization, about voter contact, and that's what both parties are trying to do right now.
Yeah. And how could increase participation from like certain groups that, for example, did not want to cast a ballot back then, would change the results of this election in general?
Yeah, so absolutely. So, in some ways, this election is going to be about the people who might or might not get off the couch more so than it is people who listen to programs like this, right? If you listen to a
Yeah.
program like this, you probably already have your mind made up. That's important. It's absolutely critical to our democracy. So in no way am I saying minimizing it, but in terms of the electoral outcome, the key is more about who gets off the couch, who doesn't get off the couch. Previously, we used to think that non-voters were more likely to be Democrats. What we see with Trump is these kind of irregular voters, they actually lean a little
Mm,
bit more heavily towards Trump. The good news from that takeaway is that wanting higher voter turnout isn't really a partisan outcome. It is just better for democracy, period. So whether you lean right or whether you lean left, I think one thing we should be able to agree on is we need people to show up and vote.
yeah, for sure. Um, and now with, talking about ballots and stuff, the mailing ballots are actually going out tomorrow, Friday, September 6th. And so North Carolina is among the first states to send out those mailing ballots. And how does that influence voter turnout?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we are the first state in the country. So we're in a fight with Ohio, which one is really first in flight.
Yeah.
The one thing we can agree on is we're first in mail ballot. Whether that's a brag point or not, you can decide. But yeah, we are sending them out on Friday. So if you have requested a mail ballot, and in North Carolina, you can request one with no excuse, unlike many states. And
Mhm.
that's going to go out on Friday. We're going to get ballots back as early as Saturday. So, what does that mean? In the 2020 election, mail ballots were almost one in every five ballots cast. But of course, the 2020 election was marked by the worst of the COVID crisis.
Right.
I think we're going to see certainly fewer than 5% of ballots cast by mail this time. I think for Democrats, it's an opportunity to try to maximize the bang that they're getting from this enthusiasm buck that's happening right now. So getting folks to go out before the enthusiasm wanes. But the Republicans, are also trying to get this mail balloting turnout or effect. So in the past, it used to be that Republicans use mail balloting more than Democrats. That flipped after Donald Trump said, hey, Republicans don't use mail balloting. So Republicans listen and
Yeah.
Democrats listen by doing the opposite. And
Hmm.
now there's a Republican movement called Bank Your Vote. And they're saying, hey, Republicans, you can use mail balloting too, and you can use early voting too. Let's go ahead and bank our ballots as well as the Democrats. And so, what I'm hoping is that we see a lot of people use these early and mail voting options, but that we don't see as big of a partisan gap as we have in the past.
Right. So they're changing kind of the narrative now. I see.
Exactly.
That's interesting. Um, so talking more about national kind of level issues, well, candidates have picked already their vice presidents, their ticket. So I wanted to ask you, what does each vice president candidate bring to each ticket?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the in the past, the evidence suggests that vice presidential candidates rarely, if ever, make a big electoral difference. It doesn't mean it's not an important selection, but the direct effect is pretty minimal. The one big, bright exception to that rule was Sarah Palin, and that was in a negative direction. The evidence suggests that actually was a drag on McCain's campaign. With
Wow.
that said, it's the first major decision that most candidates make. And so the indirect effects, as a couple of political scientists have argued, may actually be real. It may actually be important. Here, I think we're seeing that the JD Vance pick has not gone over quite as well. That a lot of people are
Mhm.
using that as evidence of decision making that didn't go so well. There's been a lot of past statements that are being brought up. Probably while we're having this conversation, there's two more being revealed on Twitter. For Tim Walz, I think it's tended to go a little bit better thus far. Now, whether things change remains to be seen, but at least thus far, that seems to have been a safer pick. I don't think. I mean, certainly there are people from the right that are hitting on him, but he doesn't appear to be turning anybody away from the Democratic ticket. And he doesn't appear to be reinforcing some of the more negative stereotypes of Democrats. Whereas J.D. Vance, some of these comments in particular about women, some folks are arguing that that may be true. So I don't think either one's going to have a huge effect. I think thus far, Walz has been a safer pick, but we've also got a couple of months till this thing is done.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot to just like kind of see how it goes. But
Right.
from your perspective, I wanted to ask you, what are other significant kind of national level political events or developments or issues that we should be on the lookout, for that might influence the upcoming elections and specifically here as well in North Carolina?
Yeah, absolutely. So, actually, this morning, so we're talking just before 9 a.m. on Thursday, September 5th, and at 9:30 in the morning on Thursday, September
Yeah.
5th, RFK Jr. is going to be in court, and he is trying to get off the ballot in North Carolina. This is really
Hmm.
interesting, right? He fought really hard to get on the ballot. Now he's fighting to get off the ballot. Oh yeah, and by the way, at the same time, he's trying to get on the ballot in New York. And so, if you're confused, I don't blame you. It's a confusing thing. Um, but I think the logic is he is trying to get off the ballots in the purple states and the battleground states where he can make the difference because he'd prefer to see Trump than Harris. But in a state
Mhm.
like New York, it's going to vote for the Democratic candidate, whether it's, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, or Mickey Mouse, or a state like Oklahoma, where it's going to vote for the Republican candidate. Again, no matter who
Right.
it is, he says, well, I'd like to stay on the ballot in those states to kind of stay in the mix. And so that could be a difference maker, especially in a
Mhm.
state like North Carolina, where the margins are tiny, state like Arizona, Georgia, where the margins are, fewer than 12,000 votes in the
Right.
2020 election. That's a key thing to watch, and it's happening right now.
Yeah. Um, and that's really interesting. Like I heard about it, but like I was really confused. As you said, it's just like a confusing situation how he wants to just like change it. But yeah, that's on another day conversation. Um, but just in general, also like kind of expanding into national issues. I know we talk about abortion and the border as well. Um, on the national level, do you see those two issues kind of like having an impact just in general in like these elections, just not in North Carolina, but just like national level?
Yes, absolutely. I think the issues that we see in North Carolina are very much national issues, right? We've seen this
Hmm.
big nationalization of all politics. We used to say all politics is local. Today, really, all politics is national. So, yes, I think abortion, the border, the economy, those three issues you're going to hear about in North Carolina. You're going to hear about them in North Dakota. You're going to hear about them in California. You're going to hear about them in Delaware. So, it's going to be throughout the country. I think those are going to be the big three of this election.
Yeah. Well, this has been a very insightful interview. Thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I think just that, I mean, it's pretty amazing times that we're living through. And so I hope folks are able to take some time to pay attention and to remember too that there's a whole lot going on down ballot. We have 10 council of state races. The governor is only one of those that's up this year. We have 170 state legislative seats open. We've got hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of city council, county commission seats up. So there's a lot going on. It's easy to get completely taken with the top of the ticket. I know I do sometimes,
Yeah.
but pay attention to what's going on down farther. There's some really important races there.
Yeah, for sure. Next on the program, we have another interview with a political analyst talking about elections. I'm your host, Emilia Rivadeneira, and here with us today is a very special guest, Michael Bitzer, Leonard Chair of Political Science and Professor of Politics and History at Catawba College. Thank you so much for being here today, Michael. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. So in our last program, we kind of kicked off this new segment called Politics Unpacked, in which we're going to kind of dive deep into election matters. And today, I kind of wanted to explore additional specific issues that might influence election outcomes in North Carolina, as well as kind of recent developments that have been happening recently regarding the elections. And one of those being kind of, Trump and Harris are set to face off in their first presidential debate on Tuesday. So what can we anticipate from this encounter?
Boy, that's a great question because I think for both candidates, they're really going to be viewing this as potentially uncharted territory. They haven't really gone at each other, haven't really interacted with each other. So the first thing I think as a political scientist kind of watching the debate, what is the kind of tenor and tone that each of the candidates take? I think we have certainly experienced a number of interactions with Donald Trump, being former president, being now a multi-time candidate. He's got a very unique and distinctive style that he brings to it. He's very confrontational. I think with the muted microphones, we're going to have to kind of watch and see how that really plays out. But I think from his vantage point, both candidates are going to be focused on their issues, their core policy, advocacy. But I think he really wants to try and get into a challenging battle with Harris. I think for Harris, with her experience as a prosecutor, her experience in the courtroom, her experience as a U.S. senator and, basically interrogating witnesses from time to time, I think she's going to take a very kind of lawyerly approach to this, but I don't think she's going to back down in any way, shape, or form. I mean, if you think back to the debate she had with Mike Pence in 2020, she was very clear she was not going to let him get the upper hand to the point where she said, Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. I think we're going to see that kind of approach. And the question I really have is Trump going to be much more negative, much more confrontational, much more an attack dog? And does Harris try and deflect some of that, but bring the joy and enthusiasm that she's been trying to convey on the campaign trail? These are not really debates as it is more, I want to get my talking points across and make the connections to the voters, but we'll see how much give and take the both sides have.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned the tone of, each candidate as well. And so how the tone or like overall debate performance of each candidate impact their overall campaign strategy.
Yeah, I think certainly debates are highly watched nowadays. And for the most part, we think maybe there's some potential impact or effect on the campaign. For the most part, debates kind of come and go unless there's something consequential. I mean, the first debate was significant in terms of its impact. It ultimately brought Joe Biden out of the race and put Harris into the race. I think, what this may have is certainly nationwide attention because we will see the two of them go against each other and how do each one of them respond to the other. And I think for the audience looking, so much of what we know about American politics now is that the significant majority of Americans are pretty much locked into their partisan tribalism, is very much partisan loyalty, and they'll be rooting for their side and booing the other side. I mean, I think the only, probably worst kind of experience is maybe ACC football or basketball in that regard in terms of the partisan loyalty. But for the few folks that are undecided or that are questioning, can I really support this candidate over that candidate? This may give them the sense of, hey, I like what he or she was presenting, or, oh no, there's no way I could support her or him. So I think this is a historic debate. It has been a very long time since we've had a former president running for, to be reelected in his own right. This is the first, woman of color to make this bid. We're living in historic times.
Yeah, for sure. And what are kind of the issues or like topics that we can expect to hear in this debate from each side?
I think both sides are really going to be focused on their set of issues and not necessarily respond to the other side. So if you think about on the Republican side, what Trump is going to be focused on, economics, particularly inflation. Even though that has been significantly coming down, he's still going to present it as we're in record territory of inflation and things just cost, exorbitant. I think immigration, I think crime will be among his big issues. I think for Harris and her side, it's almost not necessarily a policy issue as it is, again, I go back to this idea of tone, of, a positive sense of looking at things and acknowledging the challenges, acknowledging the issues of prices are still high. We need middle class support. We need to tackle education cost. She is certainly going to hit on reproductive rights and abortion, and I think that will be critical. I'm curious if she's going to try and attempt to negate any of Trump's issues, for example, immigration. She made it very clear in her acceptance speech for the nomination that if the very bipartisan border bill came back, she would sign it. And that is probably one of the most conservative pieces of legislation on that issue. But does she use that as kind of trying to take away something that Trump could potentially hit her on?
Right.
That's what I'm going to be interested and fascinated to watch.
Yeah. And another thing that I wanted to bring up was it appears to be, especially here in North Carolina, this Harris effect of like voter registration. And so I wanted to ask you, is this true?
Yes, we have seen a definitive Harris effect. If you look at just this summer, so in June, and this has been the trend line for some time, when people register to vote, they pick one of a multitude of party registrations. And for the vast majority of new voters, they're actually picking unaffiliated. Interestingly enough, among college students, Gen Z generation, 50% are registered unaffiliated. But when you get into the partisan registration, Republicans have been ahead of registered Democrats for some time up until July 21st. When Biden withdrew, when he endorsed Harris, when Harris, said, I am definitely running, we saw the two parties flip. And there was a significant bump up in Democratic registration. Now, that has tapered off as we've gotten further in time, but it's been fairly close, and we've seen the kind of Harris effect when it comes to things like voter registration. We've certainly seen it with fundraising. We've seen it with the polling and the dynamics of voter engagement, but voter registration is another key signal of this Harris effect.
Yeah, for sure. And with that, I also wanted to touch about voter turnout and, want to explore, is voter enthusiasm and turnout, like how is that going to shape just elections here in North Carolina as well?
So my basic rule of thumb with North Carolina's electorate, those voters that show up to cast a ballot, it's basically the 97-3 rule. 97% of the electorate is baked in for one side or the other. So, imagine 46% Republican, 45% Democratic. They're locked in. They're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
The three are the swing voters, the persuadable voters, the voters that could vote for Donald Trump in 2020 and then turn around and vote for Roy Cooper for governor, Republican and then Democrat.
Right.
And in North Carolina, it is literally all about who shows up and the turnout rate. So in 2020, we had 75% of registered voters show up to vote, which was a record for us. But if you look specifically within generational cohorts, for example, you would find that among baby boomers, among the oldest generation, their turnout rate was 86%, well above the statewide turnout of 75. Gen Z down to 61.
Wow.
And right now, if you take voters under the age of 45, so millennials and Gen Z, they're a plurality of the voter pool. They can dominate. But the problem is they don't show up to their political strength, to their political power. Now, this year, that might be a change. But, it matters in terms of turnout because every generation has a very distinctive political dynamic too. We see it with race. We see it with urban versus rural versus suburban dynamics. It matters who shows up because then they're conveying their political power along with everybody else in their group.
Right. And what might be those reasons that specifically Gen Z, that generation, does not show up to vote?
Well, I mean, it's very typical in terms of what we know. Younger voters always don't show up, and older voters do. The classic, laugh line that I use in my classes is do not stand in front of a retirement center on election day because they will run you over with their wheelchairs. They'll knock you over with their oxygen tanks. They will show up to vote. It's young people that maybe haven't been socialized into understanding politics. They're just getting to be educated about political issues, about voting mechanisms and dynamics. And we think as somebody grows older, their life cycle gets them more involved and engaged. Right. But I think this year, the Harris campaign has recognized what they need to do and who they need to target. And in North Carolina, it's particularly black voters in central cities and in rural counties, and it's people under the age of 45.
Right. And that was another question that I was going to ask. Is, are black North Carolinian voters now motivated as well to go to vote?
Yeah, that's going to be, I think, one of the fascinating questions we as
Yeah.
political scientists are trying to figure out.
Mhm.
You know, in '08, when Barack Obama made the historic candidacy that he had, what we saw that year was registered Democrats were equal to what registered Republicans did in turnout. Every election since '08, registered Republicans have been 5 points higher, registered Democrats only at the state average. And if you look at the racial dynamics, we've seen in the past several elections, black registered voters have a lower than statewide turnout rate. And it was interesting that in 2022, with Beasley, the Democrat, an African American woman running as a first, black turnout did not meet the statewide average. So I think that there's a combination of things playing itself out, but campaigns have to understand the targeting and the mobilization, and they have got to be focused on that. And I think for the Harris campaign, the fascinating thing that I've seen is she's got 25 field offices in North Carolina. That built on what Biden was doing, but she expanded.
Right.
That's more than Barack Obama did in '08. And there has never been that kind of investment on the ground that we'll have to see if it pays off
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to bring that up as well because, persuasion can do so much.
I mean, a lot of people see all these negative ads and are thinking, well, that doesn't apply to me. I'm going to discount it. There is a small portion, but the persuasion effect is fairly mooted once you get closer and closer to the election because people's partisan loyalties really kind of harden and get solidified. And so it'll be interesting to see how they take that.
Right. And another thing I wanted to bring up, it was mentioned actually in one of your blog posts. So you mentioned that the real test of voter enthusiasm, like what we have been talking about, will be likely to begin on October 17 with the start of early in-person voting.
Yep.
And so I wanted to ask you, what can we expect from this period of time of early voting?
Yeah, so as we're recording it, we have found out that absentee by mail ballots have been put on hold.
Yeah.
So that's a new wrinkle into all of this that we'll have to see how it kind of plays out. Usually, mail-in voting is about 3 to 4% of the total votes. So in 2020, we had 5.5 million votes cast. About 3% of them came by the mail. The significant bulk, well over 60% of the votes cast, will be done in that in-person early voting starting on October 17th and running to the Saturday right before General Election Day. People love the convenience of early voting. North Carolinians have taken to this and just run with it. And early on, I think that was one of the reasons why Barack Obama did so well to flip this state, because they can bank ballots. And if I am looking to these targeted voters, and if these voters on this side have already banked their ballot, I don't have to worry about them. They are done. I can now move on and focus on some others.
Right.
And, at first it was heavily Democratic. Now, based on 2020 numbers, Republicans have caught up and it's at parity. We'll have to see how this year plays out. But, the power of early voting to bank those ballots and then move on to your next target group, I actually vote on election day because I can walk into my precinct, get a ballot, fill it out, walk out. I'm done in 5 minutes. When I went to go early vote, I was standing in line. And I looked at it one day and I went, you know better than this, Bitzer. I mean, you know that the lines are going to be out the door for early voting.
Right.
Just vote on election day. So that's what I do.
Yeah. And another interesting thing that I wanted to bring up about voter turnout and engagement as well is the study that Katawa College did. I also saw it, and like the survey which reveals that over 70% of North Carolinians expressed confidence in this election, like the 2024 election. And so how this level of confidence you think will influence voter turnout in this election?
I think that this is a fundamental component of our grand experiment in self-governance, and that is, do the voters who have the ultimate power through their votes have confidence that their votes will be counted?
Yeah.
And I think for a baseline, this was the first real in-depth study that Catawba College and YouGov did together to kind of get a sense of North Carolina's public opinion about it. I think 70% is good. Would I love to see it at 90%? Yes. I think that with the past several years of questions, of concerns, and let's be frank about it, some candidates exploiting the power of misinformation and disinformation, I think 70% is a good benchmark, but we need to be better at it. And I think what we have found through two groups, one of which is doing a series of town halls across the state to introduce what happens on election day. How does the preparation begin for casting ballots? Once people know the information and once people understand the processes, particularly if it's their local community, that confidence even goes higher. It's when you start asking, well, are you confident that New York's going to count their votes accurately, or Texas or Florida? That's when, far removed, people go, I don't know about their systems.
Right.
I can't trust them. I can trust my local. I can trust my county to count my votes accurately. So that's kind of the positive thing. The one concern out of that data was a very clear partisan divide, that Democrats consistently had greater confidence than Republicans. And I think we as a general public need a better understanding, but we also need to make sure we don't accept whatever somebody is saying as the gospel truth without, I need to do a little research. I need to look into this to better understand it.
Right. And what does this percentage, 70%, signify for our democracy just in general? Like, having that confidence that our votes will be counted accurately.
I think that is a positive. If it had been 50-50, I would have great concern for that. I think we are in a very tumultuous time. Political polarization is rampant. The lack of trust in basic institutions. It's no surprise that people are concerned, but I think having confidence in the main participatory manner that people can govern themselves in this democratic republic of ours gives me some hope that we've got work to do, but we've always had work to do in the United States. Let's kind of build on it.
Right, yeah. Another thing that I wanted to touch was, so I've seen in online media as well that North Carolina is considered a purple state.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you your thoughts on this. Is this true?
Well, if you consider purple to be within, and this is where the geeky math person comes out and political scientist, if you consider purple to be anywhere from 45 to 55, we are dead in the middle. We are typically a 51-49 state, dependent on the level of the election. So at the federal level, U.S. President, U.S. Senate, we're typically 51-49. For things like the governor race, we're 51-49 for the Democrats. So combine those two, we are very, and this has been true since 2008, we're very much a purple state. And I think we reflect a lot of the national dynamics as well, urban versus rural, generational politics, the polarization between the partisanship. I think we are kind of a petri dish microcosm of what the national dynamics are like here in North Carolina.
Right. Yeah. And moving on to like a more like national kind of like
Sure.
level issue, both candidates already picked their vice presidents.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask you, what does each vice president candidate has to bring to the ticket, you know?
That's a great question. I think some of the research in political science says it's not necessarily the person that gets picked as vice president. It's what does this say about the presidential candidate?
Right.
That's kind of the greatest effect that a VP candidate pick has. I think for the Trump Vance ticket, what J.D. Vance brings is a confirmation of where the Republican Party is now, particularly under Donald Trump. I think what the Republican Party has gone through is really an evolution to Trumpism, and Vance reflects that kind of Trumpism, Republicanism that Trump wanted to see in his own vice president. I mean, if Mike Pence, was everything that Donald Trump thought he was, he would pick him again. Well, he didn't. And I think he was looking for somebody that would be very much the yes man to Trump. Waltz is a fascinating pick on the Democratic side. He used to represent a fairly rural congressional district in Minnesota. He's a governor, but he is much more of a progressive kind of governor from Minnesota. And I think what Harris looked at with Waltz was very much somebody that can join me and present a kind of happy warrior, but, you punch me, I'm going to punch you right back kind of thing. And I think, that debate between Waltz and Harris is really going to be fascinating as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And wait, now that we're on the issue of the debate of
Sure.
what are your thoughts on that? Like, I want to hear a little bit more about that.
I just think that that's going to be a fun one to watch. Certainly have your popcorn popped because it's going to be a great TV episode. Both men are going to come, again, like their presidential candidates. They're going to come with talking points, key ideas that they want to make. The question is, how do they interact with each other and how do they respond to each other? And I think Vance is certainly going to tout the strong Trump Republican platform and ideas. He's doing that on the talking circuit. So that's what VPs are designed to do. Waltz is much more of a kind of free agent at times and can basically go his own direction but still advance Harris's general points. So I think the two of them, sometimes VPs are seen as the pit bulls of the presidential ticket, that maybe leaving the presidents not to be the attack dogs, but their role is to go after each other. We may see a lot of that in that particular debate as well.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll definitely have my popcorn for that one. And another question on the VP side is, so what are the campaign's message framing? I feel like we have seen a lot of that, especially on social media. Well, I'm on social media a lot, and I've definitely seen a lot of that. So I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, I think, the main core of any campaign is really framing a theme, describing it in a certain tone, and delivering it throughout the timing of the campaign. And I think the major themes, on the Republican side, it's very clear. It's a resurgence of Make America Great Again. It's always about that dynamic. To me, the question about that is, have we reached the end of the Reagan coalition And with this new generational dynamic that's potentially at play, is it time for a new kind of coalition to be developed? We're going to have to wait and see how that plays out, but it feels very much like, we want to go back into the past.
Yeah.
Harris has been very intentional in saying, we're not going back, we're looking forward. And that kind of theme, that kind of tone, a positive tone to her campaign, I think, if we're talking about the VP debate and the presidential debate, I think that's going to be the way that both sides are going to frame their perspective and then attack the other side. So, as you're watching these debates kind of unfold, think about how are they positioning themselves? How are they framing what the core fight is in this campaign? Is it future bound or is it past bound? Is it, well, if they get into power, it's going to be doom and gloom, or, we're going to try and present a hopeful, sense of things. I think those kinds of fundamentals, that's where voters tend to naturally gravitate to.
No, yeah, for sure. And that's definitely something that I think, Gen Z or college students are going to be focused on too as well.
Yeah, I think, and certainly the age dynamic. I mean, that was the biggest issue, I think, with the crisis of confidence before July 21 in Biden. Is he able to really relate to the broad spectrum? I think with Harris's campaign now, Trump is now the candidate of the older age.
Right.
And how does that play into this dynamic as well? Some fascinating questions we'll have to kind of watch unfold.
No, yeah, for sure. And also, I wanted to ask you as well, we have talked about the presidential debate and like BP candidates and all of that, but in your opinion, what are other kind of issues or developments that us college students or North Carolinians in general should be on the lookout for, like the next couple of weeks, heading to elections?
Yeah, I think certainly, first and foremost, make sure you're registered to vote. You've got a deadline of October 11th to get formally registered. That does not necessarily mean you can't get registered after that, but that's the deadline that we have in state law. You can register and cast an early ballot at the same time. And it's typically what we call same-day registration. If you miss that October 11th deadline, and then when early voting starts on October 17th, you're not registered, have no fear. You can go to an early voting site, say, I want to register and cast a ballot, and they'll do that at the same time. So certainly being registered is the foremost thing to being able to cast a ballot. I think, the sense of deep divide in our politics, and I think that it is really evident within the Gen Z cohort that y'all have seen the division, the anger, the constant fighting, and I think it is a perception of, I don't want to be labeled with that, so I'm going to be registered as unaffiliated. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not partisan. You're just, the labels have become so toxic that you don't want that affiliation necessarily. But I think taking the time to understand the candidates, there are more candidates and offices than just president and governor. We are electing 9 other statewide executive officers, attorney general, superintendent of public instruction. We're electing members of the U.S. House of Representatives. We're electing members to the state legislature that determines state budgets for NC State University. How much is tuition going to be? Well, it's partly due to how much state funding you get from the legislature. Having a basic understanding of some of the policy issues that you are concerned about, but then taking the time to learn where the candidates stand on those issues, and in particularly if a candidate shows up on campus or they're having a town hall, go. Ask them, where do you stand on this issue? Because ultimately the political power rests with us, we the people. And if we want our politicians and elected officials to be accountable, we need to be accountable to ourselves to ask them the hard questions. Where do you stand on this issue? And to have the knowledge to be able to ask those questions.
Right, for sure. And another question, you bring up something really important, that it's, college students should ask that question of like, what matters to me, what matters, like what policies. And I know that if we go through all of the policies of each candidate, this episode would be just too long. But I wanted to ask you, like, what do you think are those like policies of each candidate that would, like, like college students are in college students' minds, like, in your opinion, like kind of like a mini recap? I know that's, like.
Well, I think certainly, economics is always going to be at the forefront. And for most college students, the question is, am I going to get a job? Can I make and earn a living after college? And so certainly, can I buy things? Can I, pay my rent? Those kinds of basic economic issues are always at the forefront of all voters, not just college students. But I think certainly things like the cost of education. I think, for some folks, the issue of reproductive rights and abortion rights. For others, it's concerns about, what is the role of immigration into our society. I know that on some college campuses, the Gaza-Israeli situation has become very pronounced in terms of concerns and issues. So there's no one designated policy area, I think. And this is true for all ages of voters. But if voters don't show up who are concerned about a policy issue, but they choose not to show up, that means they're not only missing out on their vote getting expressed, but they're missing out on their policy emphasis, their policy focus getting missed out as well. And, I just think that we have a unique system of governance. It has its flaws, but I always remind students, in the preamble, it doesn't say in order to make a perfect union. It's to make a more perfect union. And in order for us to continue moving towards that more perfect union, we the people have to show up. We the people have to participate. We have to know what our issues are and get them conveyed to our elected officials.
Right, for sure. So this has been a very insightful interview. Thank you so much for being in the program. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I think, just all I can do is say raise the rate, folks. Make it go from 61 to, let's shoot for 70. 70% of Gen Zers showing up. I think if that happens, there will be a seismic shift in North Carolina politics that will feel like a political earthquake. But it's going to take people doing the hard work and showing up.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much once
again. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
This has been your host, Emilia Rivadeneira. Thanks for listening to Eye on the Triangle. For back episodes of the show, go to wknc.org/podcasts. Music in today's episode is Krakatoa by Noah Stark, licensed under Creative Commons.